In the house, you could open a closet and there'd be dresses from the 1800s.
Too cool.
Right, exactly. I open another one, there's tuxedos. You could still open a closet and see a fox hunting jacket. There might be some old silver in a silverware drawer, but pretty much it was a time capsule, this house. So here we are. The chronology of the entrepreneurial story is important because sometimes what I found is that there's big gaps missing, and then somebody who achieves success has either forgotten about those gaps or doesn't have any sort of visuals on those gaps. And luckily I have pictures of everything. I always had a camera in hand and I took old school pictures and just happened to have that. So chronologically, what's important about the next pivot, after I moved out of the Lorelei loft, I was absolutely burned out from business, and my intention was to move to Colorado. I had all these romantic ideas of what Colorado would be for me. And I rented a car when I got to Colorado, and I crashed the rental car. And it was symbolic of my success in Colorado. And when I came back, my mom had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. My stepfather had a big place in the suburbs, and he inherited from his parents. I don't know, it's not a lifestyle that I grew up with, but my stepfather grew up with a very unique lifestyle at the time. He was an artist trapped in a kind of a business socialite world. He was the type of guy who, he lived at the YMCA when he was older downtown just because art was his absolute priority. Anyways, he inherited it. It was a big house, big by my standards. And so I lived there with the idea of I was going to look after it over the winter. And instead it turned into 3 years that I lived there. The first year I had some money because when I closed the business, I set aside some money. I don't know what it was, $20,000 or $30,000, which was a lot to me. I didn't sell the business, I just closed it. I didn't even know you could sell a business. That first winter was a little bit lonely, kind of ghosts in the house lonely, big house, nobody there, just me and Sadie, the cat. It took a while for me to decompress from the business rhythm. 30 and single again. It was a place that forced me to get out of the city pace. I began going to the library. I went to the gym. The day was my own. And then when spring rolled around, we talked and my mom wasn't getting better. It just took a long time for her to recover, and I stayed at the house and was watching after it. We needed a roof. I was there for the roofers, that type of thing. Well, in the meantime, they had this outbuilding that was for an old tractor or storage or something. And I turned that into a studio and I began making my own art. And I decided that I was going to write some how-to books because when I was in school, I had this idea that the mold making books that existed were written by retired pros and they forgot what a beginner needed to know. And I said, I'm going to write books about what a beginner needs to know. So I set up this studio, I set up a photo arm, and I would take pictures sequentially of how I was making the molds. The studio was great. It was me and the mice. There was so many mice in that studio. And in the winter, it was really rough because the cement slab would freeze in the winter. And so it was like I was standing on an ice rink working in the art studio. And although it had a heater, that cement never warmed up. So I would put mats down, I'd wear big boots. But I was out there, I was doing this, I was writing these books. I would do the pictures by day and I would write the captions by night. I wrote 6 books. It was a multi-volume series called The Art of Mold Making. The first 2 volumes were for ceramic mold makers. I went through this lengthy process of publish a book. How do I get a publisher? And each step was the longest. So I read books. I was at the library all the time. So I read books on what I needed to do to get a publisher. It's like, oh, you need a proposal. Then I got books on how to write proposals. And then I wrote the proposal, which was a beast. And it was sample chapters. So I had to write the sample chapters. And then I'm like, oh, what publisher is appropriate? Then I would go to the library and I'd get books on what publishers. And then I would write all these letters to these publishers. Can I send you the proposal? This, that, and the other. They came back. I remember one frustrating story because people around me know I'm not technically savvy. I had a computer and a printer is about it there. And I got to the point where I'd read all these books, written the proposal, was sending out printing envelopes. I was ready to print envelopes and the printer wouldn't work. I was so mad. I smashed that printer because I had a year plus been all this momentum and then a printer was going to stop me. I was alone too long by myself is what this is a diagnosis of. At that point, one letter did come back from a publisher and they said, this book is amazing. We'd like to publish it. Let's send you a contract. I was so excited, validation. And then I saw the contract. And the contract was basically a glorified work for hire, which basically means that the entire content of the book they own. Now, it's not uncommon in publishing, but there's usually room for some negotiations. And what I was concerned about is that if that publisher went out of business, I lose all these, that book never gets reprinted again or anything. I'd read a lot of business law books in my journey of how to publish, and I had the time. I wasn't working. And it was me in the gym. I was good. that ended up just getting put on the side for a long time. So did the other books, because I thought if this is what it means, I'm going to have to figure out a way to publish my own books, because this just goes nowhere. Luckily, it was content that doesn't expire. It's not like computer tech manuals. When I lived in that, I guess a lot of people call it a mansion, it was a time where I was rich and poor at the same time, because I had the representation of my stepfather's legacy wealth, this house that someone very wealthy had built. Although that era had passed, the house still stood. You could still open a closet and see a fox hunting jacket. There might be some old silver in a silverware drawer, but pretty much it was a time capsule, this house. What I didn't realize was happening is subconsciously, I was absorbing the craftsmanship essence of this house, and it impacted the art that I was making. It had sort of, I remember finding a bird cage that you wound up and the birds sung. That's upstairs, actually. Old movie projectors. And that aesthetic began to kind of creep into my interest with surrealism. Because the house, although it wasn't ornate, it was well built. Solid doors, the latches, all that stuff. I realized this is what continued my interest in craftsmanship, that I needed to be in a well-built place. Paper mache walls were not for me if I had a choice. So that was the beautiful part of it, is I was making art and writing books. I stayed busy all day. In the morning, I'd go to 7-Eleven for breakfast, and I'd get a big gulp and a cinnamon roll, and it was great. And that was my breakfast, and that would hold me for a long time. I didn't get fat because I was killing it at the gym. I'm so envious of those days. And the sad part is I began to run out of money quite quickly. I remember it got to the point where the muffler dropped on my SUV. I had this old Isuzu Trooper, which was at the time a really neat kind of Jeep thing, and it was my success business car. I had a car phone in it at the time, and it was great, but I couldn't afford to fix it. I had repaired the muffler so many times with heated tape, and it got to the point where I even took it to the muffler shop one time, and they raised it up on the lift, and I remember the mechanics had called all their guys over, and they were counting the patches that I'd put in my exhaust system. Finally, I'm like, I got to cut this thing off. I didn't have a car lift, I didn't have car tools, and I remember backing the car off the drive. The house had a long driveway, and it was pitched, and I remember backing the car off of this so it created a gap under the car so that I could crawl under the car. I had a saw, an electric saw, that I was going to cut the pipe off of the car, but the gap wasn't big enough, so now I'm digging a hole under the car so I could put the saw under the car to cut it was pathetic. I barely had money for gas. Like I said, I was rich and poor at the same time, and even when my wife Katya says, oh, well, that would have been, you were single, you're in shape, you're living in a mansion, did you date any girls? And I was like, no, I couldn't afford to take anybody to dinner, and I wasn't asking my parents for money. They were already letting me live there and use the shop. It was very strange to be in both worlds. Truly, I was a caretaker, and that was the intention, but I felt extremely productive with art. This is when I made all the art that you see around the building, the butterfly, the bird in the hand, the subconscious, the books. I mean, I had all day. I made sculpting my job. Book writing and sculpting was what I did that for 2 or 3 years. And then my friend and mentor, Richard, came out. He's a retired lawyer, and he always liked being around art. And he's like, hey, I'm getting off the bench. I want to make art. Let me come out there. He drove out to Barrington one time, and he's like, this is too freaking far. He said, we need to get you a place in the city. My buddy owns a building. And so he got me set up. He said, you're too young to be living alone out in the woods. You're not meeting anybody. You're 30 years old. Did you go on a date this year? And I'm like, he's like, Jesus Christ, get out of here. So he rescued me in a way, but it was to another location where I had to start a business all over again. That is when I moved into what I called the Kitty Bunker, which was my illegal basement shop on the south side of Chicago. And I was there for 10 years. It was another place of mixed blessings.
Okay, so Kitty Bunker is another story then. Tell me how it felt being, so you were in your 30s, early 30s. Let's say 31, 32, 33. And I would say you were at your creative blooming stage, right?
Absolutely.
Books, sculptures, you found your style probably, right?
Yes.
And that was alone time.
Yes.
And that was in nature.
Yes.
So I would say that don't take an artist from a place where he is creative.
Oh, but you see, I was very hungry. And I was socially starving.
So
always
3 years was enough, more or less, right?
That was my Walden Pond. I had great spaceship dreams out there. Many hours on the tractors, deer, raccoons, noises at night, in a big empty house. I remember, we had this going to bed routine, me and my cat Sadie. If I, whatever I was done for the evening, I used to keep a lot of lights on in the house because it was a big place. And I'd pick her up and I'd throw her on my shoulder and we'd walk around the house together and we'd turn out all the lights and I'd go up and go to bed. It was this antique bed, hand carved. It was very beautiful, but it was very small. And she'd jump off my shoulder. I'd lift the covers and she'd go right under the covers to stay warm. And then I would stay up reading books, whatever art books I had, just to get ideas. And we had this rhythm, but the whole day centered around art and creativity.
How did it feel for a person like you to be alone for such a long time? I mean, thanks God we have animals, right? We have companions who can cheer up your day like this, but human interaction. An artist without a human interaction. This is what I'm asking.
I had that all through. It felt like that human interaction was either restricted or zeroed out. And in Barrington, it was zeroed out. I think that my only social interaction was when I went to the gym. I went to the YMCA every evening at 6 o'clock. I would stay on the treadmill longer if there was a pretty girl nearby. I mean, I was so lonely. It's embarrassing, but I really was. I mean, look, 30s, I was in shape. Had a lot of fire, had a lot of creativity, a lot of interesting things going on, but I didn't have any bank. I couldn't have gone out to dinner. I couldn't have. What am I going to do at 30? Call my mom, hey mom, I want to go on a date? Come on. It just doesn't work that way. And I kept thinking that the change was right around the corner. That book offer was going to come around the corner. That whatever was going to come around the corner. It expired. Art can be very lonely. For other people, they have found art to be their social destination. It wasn't for me. In art school, alone. I feel like a little actual PTSD about it, emotional PTSD about it, because I was so lonely. I didn't know how to change it. I volunteered at an art organization in Barrington, and there was this older woman who ran it, and she took a liking to me, but I was just like, it's not going to go the way she's like, oh, we'll go to Europe together. We'll go to this. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, your daughter's beautiful. What do I say, right? It was a mismatch. But I look back at those years as emotionally starved, spiritually and artistically critical. It defined my aesthetic.
I was asking that question because I believe many artists in heart, they go through stages of loneliness, through maybe even defining yourself as introvert and just being in your art and not needing people at all. My question is how much that separation is good or bad for an artist.
Well, of course, it depends on the artist. I think that I needed creative space to create, but I would have loved to have come home to a partner, would have loved to step out of my routine and go out to dinner. I would go to Barrington's a beautiful area. There's nature walks. I would just go by myself, I was trying to enjoy the beauty, but I really wanted to have a special girl by my side. And I have a history of that being a very difficult pattern for me. So it wasn't the first time that I felt that loneliness. And I was an introvert, but I didn't want to be an introvert, you see. I was ready to make art a job, and for me, I'd had ideas, and then it was about execution. I didn't need to be alone to create. It was very different. Critical, but different. Those years, I don't remember being sad at each day. I remember turning out the light and be like, oh, I finished that chapter. I was like a prisoner. I stayed in shape. I kept a routine. I made it to this. I fed myself this. That was how I managed. But there were moments where it was just like, let me out. It was my own prison. It was the most beautiful place ever. And some people would find that a sanctuary, but there's a point that it tips. I'm just glad I don't have to do that again. And the house that I bought recently was because it's so related to the other house. Very different style, but it sits on the land. It has this long driveway. It has these big trees. Yeah, the new house is much better. Actually, it's a much nicer home, but the weight of an estate feel was the same. I was the guy in the tractor cutting the grass, right? I mean, it wasn't my house. It was in the garage was a 1950 red John Deere tractor and a 1974 green wood-paneled Chevy station wagon with a Corvette engine in it. This was not a modern environment. It was absolutely a time capsule. You go into my dad's old bedroom that he used as an adult as an art studio. And there were gun racks and archery things and sculptures and old books and old magazines. I was living in a person's shadow, and that shadow was also someone else's. It was his shadow too. It was his parents. He didn't change anything in the house from when his parents died.
You did felt a lot of influence on yourself from that space.
I absolutely absorbed the walls and the energy of craftsmanship and the desire for old money taste. That was literally old money. I mean, it was 1930s, right? That's when it was built, in the Depression, right? Come on. They told me they dug that basement after the house was built. There was some guy out there building by wheelbarrow. My stepfather was adopted, and he was adopted by Dorothy Ricketts. And Ricketts is the family that owns which baseball team? I don't know. White Sox, Cubs? I don't know. I don't know sports, but they're an extremely successful family. We have that part of the family history. It's all in trunks upstairs, the dresses, the photographs. Her dad was a wealthy jeweler in Chicago. In the house, you could open a closet and there'd be dresses from the 1800s.
So cool.
Right, exactly. I open another one, there's tuxedos. My sister probably has the dresses, and I think she took the clothing. When my parents downsized, it was all going in the dumpster, and we were terrified. We were loading up cars. I had every employee from my office come out in their cars, and they were even going to throw out Andy's art. They were so over that, being trapped to a house. It was panicky. My stepfather was a guy who, he would just rebuild things, and he didn't buy new things. He never dressed well, wasn't important. He was an outdoorsman. If he hadn't met my mom, he's the type of story you would find as an old dead guy in a chair in front of the TV who stroked out. He had a stroke. My mom actually, it's strange that those stories actually happen. That's a case that if Andy hadn't have married my mom, he would have been that artist alone for his whole life. And I don't want that. No way. So there you go. So I had 3 years of my version of Walden Pond, and I realized how the most beautiful place can also be a perfectly engineered prison if there's not balance.